Welcome to the Cutting the Gordian Knot podcast. Today we're going to be talking about God. You see, I got an email. If you haven't emailed, email me at thegordianknot101@gmail.com. I always appreciate hearing from you guys, whatever you have to say. And this fellow wanted to know why we think God isn't just like a quark field or a cloud of gas or a most fundamental particle, something like that. And then after that, why would we think that whatever this God thing is would even have a mind and a will? I mean, why isn't he just this first domino that kicks down the ensuing dominoes of causality? Why does he have to have a mind and a will? And he further wanted to know, why is this God that we're supposing going to send people to hell, right? I mean, he had a lot of questions about hell, and I couldn't quite untangle what exactly he was saying. So I'm going to be answering a lot of things at the end of the episode about hell. So if you're listening, fellow who emailed in, I hope I answer all your questions. I'm going to give it a whack. And if you have any questions, the Gordian Knot 101@gmail.com. Send them in. I love to hear them. They can be serious or not serious at all. If you've listened to the podcast at all, you'll know that they come in primarily the second category, and I certainly enjoy answering those. All right, so let's start. Why can't God just be a quark field? Why can't he just be prime matter or something like that? Why can't he be a physical thing or a thing really at all? Well, it's because physical things, and especially collections of things, have nothing to do with the concept of God. Really, it's like asking, why can't a moon be a dinosaur? Or why can't it be made out of cheese? Or why can't cheese be a fish? Well, it's because what we call God is a thing that we arrive at the end of a logical process, whereby we begin by observing facts in the universe, and then we conclude to something which must be, a being which must be. So the first way of Thomas Aquinas, for instance, shows that there must be a purely actual being that lends actuality to everything else. And this thing is what we mean by God. Why can't a basic piece of stuff be this? Well, it's just because a basic piece of stuff is not pure actuality. And if you're unfamiliar with that concept, well, I'm kind of surprised because most of my listeners are. However, I would invite you to pick up maybe a copy of Ed Feser's Scholastic Metaphysics, or to listen to one of the bevy of wonderful podcasts that will explain act potency and all that stuff. I'm going to have to just assume that you're at least reasonably familiar with these concepts, because I'm going to be covering all 5 ways of Aquinas and kind of hearing how each of them would answer these kind of questions. So that's the reason, because any type of material thing is not pure actuality. And we know this for a fact. How? Well, because that quark field, that basic particle, that whatever thing we might be trying to call God, well, it wasn't present in the same way at, say, the Big Bang as it is today. Correct? Okay, well, if it's not, or if it's going to be different in the next, say, 5 minutes than it was earlier, then that means it's moving from potentially one way to actually another, which means it could not have been pure actuality. It had to have had an admixture of potential. And therefore, it just simply is not the thing which would be concluded at, given the first way of Aquinas. And thus, it can't be called God. So to make this more clear, because I think this is actually a trickier point than maybe we give it credit for, we commonly say, well, that just doesn't fit our conception of God. And people think that's like, I don't know, just a dismissal, or we're just defining away any type of rival gods, if you will. So let me give you an analogy. It's more like if somebody, for the first time, discovered the number 10. So maybe it's me, and maybe I observe that there's 2 sets of 5. And then, after observing this in the universe, I conclude that there must be something which is 10. Now, I'm just going to call it 10, right? Then somebody said, sure, but why couldn't the thing that is simply 2 sets of 5 just be 4, or 13, or pineapple pizza? Well, it's because those things aren't what we arrived at through the observation and then the subsequent process of applying reason. So they don't fit the definition of 10. So we found a new thing. We found a number 10. Nothing that isn't 10 can just be called 10 without meeting the definition. So if it can't meet our definition of God, it's not God, it's just something else. It's a pineapple pizza. So no physical thing is pure actuality, because it can change, thus it has potential, right? And therefore it is not God. So that's how the first way of Aquinas might answer it. It's concluding at a purely actualized actualizer, which actualizes all subsequent things, and that certainly isn't a quantum field. That's nothing that can change, that could have not existed, etc. So what about the second way of Aquinas? Here we're basically saying that things need to be brought into composition, and therefore at the beginning of this chain, in order for things to actually exist, we have to have an uncomposed composer of things, something which does not require its essence and existence to be conjoined in order for it to exist. Why? Because it's not composed of these things. Its essence is its existence. And then this can then go on to subsequently actualize anything else's possibility for existence. So I'm going to be reading you guys are in for a treat, a section of a children's story that I wrote that relates to the second way of Aquinas, but more specifically was meant to explain in rabbit-based terms Barry Miller's argument for God. Pat Flynn, good friend of the show, wrote a wonderful article that clarified Barry Miller's argument for why God exists, not just existed. That would be quite the twist. All right, so he simplifies this unbelievably complicated philosopher's argument, and I joked we should just keep going. Maybe we'll write a children's story. And then, in a flood of enthusiasm, I did. So this is picking up in chapter 2. Basically, we have Thumper the rabbit wanting an imaginary friend named Frumper to be real. Frumper is a rabbit, but he has wings. He speaks fluent Chinese, and he can fly over a fence to get some delicious berries. If you want a copy of this story, I will send it to you. There are many more chapters. It is quite enjoyable, I think. So this is how the Thumper the Rabbit story explains loosely second way of Aquinas, Barry Miller's understanding of why any given thing requires a cause extrinsic to it in order for it to exist. Otherwise, it's a contrary structure. Here we go. What is the difference between a frumper and an actually existing thumper? Maybe it's the wings that Frumper gets, but birds have wings, let's not forget. Nothing about a frumper cannot be. It seems he could be like you or me. If, however, Thumper imagines a friend of contradictory fashion, this type of friend could never be, for what would his nature even mean? Take a small, helpful example. Could there ever be a square circle? No such thing could ever be, for this is contradictory. The circle could be blue or purple, but never square. That's not a circle. So, to be a friend for Thumper the Rabbit, it's reality that Frumper must inhabit. Now, Frumper is not contradictory, so what more does he need to be? What if Thumper forgot to imagine the stuff from which we are fashioned? Existence is what he seems to be missing. Can he give this to him just by wishing? Thumper tries his level best for hours, and without a rest, his mind imagines each detail non-existence to countervail. Finally, with great exhaustion, there is nothing I've forgotten. Over a bowl of carrot stew, he thinks to himself, well, what cost you? Maybe Thumper has it backwards in his attempt to manufacture what if existence is the beginning of any bunny actually living. Thumper knows that he exists, but not through his nature. He persists. Nothing in his very nature forces the hand of a creator. In this, he and Frumper are the same. Nothing about Frumper's nature is to blame. Equally, they could be real, so what's keeping Thumper from his berry meal? In frustration, Thumper utters, where are my snacking carrots and butter? Slicing the butter off the block, Thumper has a brilliant thought. There is no film on the boundary of the slices that have compounded. With every slice to the block he makes, what is it? The butter's continuity that breaks. If out of the butter he made square, the butter would not be everywhere, but instead the edges laid by the squareness given by his blade. The nature of square makes a stop. It tells the butter where be the sides and top. It seems to Thumper that what he imagined could be like squareness in this fashion. Thumper would need a butter block existentially. His wings in Mandarin create a boundary. Thumper is not made of butter. He's made of existence, Thumper stutters. Just like me and other creatures, we have definitions that define our features, but this is clearly not enough. We must be made of existence stuff. What is it that sticks these together, essence and existence of whomever? First, it would seem it must be me, that I somehow cause myself to be. But how, he thinks, can me, as Thumper, make slices to the proverbial butter? Would I not have to first be me to do the slicing that I would need? So now we have a puzzle. Can it be solved? It seems with thought we just revolve. We need a Thumper to define the edges using the essence that he expresses. But where on earth would we get Thumper when he can't exist yet? Round and round and round we go. It seems that even Thumper can't exist, but no. Thumper now, with his thoughts swirling, slowly sees the answer unfurling. He makes no sense just by his own. He cannot exist through himself alone. Thumper's very nature as a combination of existence and a certain individuation leads to a type of absurdity, only explained by one whose nature just is to be. For something of this type and kind would not have the problems that are mine. It would not have the slice of reality, but it would have it infinitely. So there you go, guys. There's my in-rhyme, children's-style, bunny-based version of the second way / Barry Miller's argument. So I hope you kind of understood that the main problem is we need to have an essence which limits existence. But that essence does not exist in any way without existence. So this is a catch-22, right? So we have to have the thing existing in order to define the existence such that the thing can be existing. But that entails it pre-existing itself. So any given structure is contradictory unless it implies a causal, efficient cause, which brings into composition its essence and existence. And the only thing which would not be subject to this criticism is a being that Thumper says simply is his own existence. And if you want way more detail on that than just my silly little poem, then email Pat Flynn and get a copy of his article if you haven't found it somewhere on the internet already, and you can explore that much further. It's not identical to the second way, but I mashed them together, much to the chagrin of some. All right, so let's ask the question. Does material meet this test? No, because its essence and existence are not the same, right? It would have the same internally contradictory structure that anything else would, and therefore it would only exist in reference to some type of efficient cause causing it to exist. So that rules out any type of material thing. That rules out anything except for the classical conception of God. So what about the third way? What does the third way have to say about this? Well, this too rules out the possibility that God could just be some material thing or prime matter or something like that. So the third way arrives at a necessary being who is necessary through itself. So if there is a way that that being could fail to exist, then it's not necessary. So could a quark field, could any of these physical things, could anything in the universe, could the universe as a whole fail to exist? Yeah, I can think of a way. Ready? Its parts fail to exist. So it's only existent because a prior condition has been met. Its parts exist, right? So if you believe that parts are more fundamental than wholes, then we can't appeal to any of these wholes. Yeah, there you go. So we can knock out any of those, the universe as a whole or any physical thing. Now, even if potentially we found something which was had no physical parts, like it was the smallest physical thing, well, it still doesn't escape this criticism. It has a bunch more, which we'll see. But it also has the composition of essence and existence. So not only is it running afoul of the second way, it's also now running afoul of the third way, because that means that it's not a necessary being, it's a contingent being. It's contingent on the persistence of its parts. Okay, so we got some other clues, right? So the third way in Aquinas' version, and he's pulling from Avicenna, I think he's also pulling from Maimonides, who might be pulling from Avicenna. Anyways, lots of smart people are pointing out that we have great tests to see if something is a necessary being or not. And here's one. Did it begin to exist? Because if it began to exist, that means it wasn't necessary. Because if it was necessary, it would have always been there. Did the universe begin to exist? Yeah. Can it be a necessary being? No. Did the things in the universe begin to exist? Yes. Can they be a necessary being? No. Therefore, can any of them meet the description of what we mean by God? No. Okay, well, maybe there is a multiverse or something, right? And you could posit that. Good luck. I'd like to hear some proof of such things. I'm open to it. Sounds like fun. But then we're going to apply the same logic to, say, a multiverse, right? And then the next question is, can it fail to exist, right? Has it ever gone out of existence? So this part I find particularly helpful when we have guys like Graham Oppy saying, well, there is an initial state which was necessary, a necessary initial state. I'm like, okay, tell me how it's necessary. Oh, it's well, it just had to be this way at the very beginning. All right, so you're saying that's a necessary being. So you're saying necessary beings are fine, and we just needed this initial necessary state, and that's our necessary being? Okay, did it change? Yeah, and then we got this. Okay, then it wasn't a necessary being, because necessary beings don't go out of existence. And your initial state is no longer the state of the universe now. Ergo, it went out of existence, therefore it's not a necessary being. You could say, well, hang on, let me try harder. It was a necessary being times 0. At which point I'm like, okay, then your being is still not necessary because its existence is contingent on it being times 0, right? So now we have a way for it to fail to exist, being time 1, etc. At which point it fails to exist, ergo is not a necessary being. So when we get a necessary being, we know it cannot fail to exist, we know that it does not begin to exist, and we know that it cannot drop out of existence. If it does any of those things, it's not a necessary being. Material things do that all the time. Therefore, they are not necessary beings, and they do not meet our qualification for being God. And of course, the only being that's necessary and necessary through himself is once again the same one that we keep on hitting on, one whose essence is his existence. So there's no ability, there's no part dependency, because there's only one thing, his essence, which is his existence. And now we get to my favorite, the fourth way of Aquinas, one that I have bothered you far too many times with. I have many episodes on this, a few things I've written, appeared on other podcasts explaining it, so I hope if you've been listening, you're pretty familiar with this, so we're going to cook through this one pretty quick. Nobility. So he argues 3 different ways here. So in the fourth way, we find that God is the maximum and therefore cause of nobility, goodness, and truth. And nobility means one's place in the hierarchy of actuality, okay? Simple things, especially the most simple things, are the lowest things on the chain of actuality. So just a little atom or some quantum thingling, that's very low. You are very high. It's very low. So if we're trying to find God, and God is defined as that which is at the very summit of actuality, looking at the most basic material things is so the wrong direction. It's absolutely the worst place to look for God, right? And to really drive this point home, I mean, you can look at the Summa and read the first section, and you'll get this from Aquinas, and you'll also get one of the only slams he ever has. He calls those people who think that prime matter is somehow God, he just calls those people idiots, which is a little mean and a little out of character for Aquinas, but it does show how wrong he thinks you are if you're looking at the most basic matter and you're imagining that's God. That is the absolute opposite of what classical theism defines as God, what we arrive at through a series of deductions after observing things in the universe. So we observe that there are these levels of nobility, and we conclude, all right, we have God at the top, and he is the cause of all of this. There we go. And And here we actually had another part of the listener's question saying, but aren't simple things like not as smart, not as powerful, God's super simple, so what's going on? And that's a great question. Here I'm going to borrow from our friends John DeRosa, Pat Flynn. I'm pretty sure I stole this example from them. But if you have a series of polygons and you continue to add sides, what they begin to look like is a circle, right? So you go triangle, square, and then you keep on adding sides. It begins to look like a circle. Now, an actual circle is something which would seem to precede the set because it only has one curved side. So it has less sides than a triangle. But in another sense, it seems like it should be on the very other end, right? Because what things are beginning to become closer and closer and closer to is the circle, as they kind of closer approximate that by adding sides. This is what's going on with God. As we move up actuality and we're going higher and higher, it's like we're adding sides. So we look more like God. We are image bearers of God than, say, a rock does. Why? Because we've added actuality. We've gone up and up and up and up. But we've also added complexity. So there's another sense in which we've moved away. So God, fittingly, is called the Alpha and the Omega. He belongs at both sides of these. He's actually the limit case, right? Where he kind of he goes over and above what is happening in the set. Belongs to the beginning and the end. Everything which is moving up is moving towards to approximate him. In another sense, he belongs at the beginning of the set. I think you get that one. Goodness. Can the universe get better or worse? Can it become more good, less good? I certainly think so, right? So in that case, Fourth Way tells us that God is the cause of and the maximum of goodness. So he cannot get any better. He just is the maximum of the good. So anything that can become more or less good is definitionally not God. So the universe or some type of structure in the universe or anything like that, if it can become better or worse, it is by definition not God. And I think that the universe could. Truth. He also says that God is the cause of and the maximum of truth. So could we have more or less truth? Could things become more or less true? Yeah, I think so. Sure. All right. Then they're not God because God is the cause and maximum of all truth. And this one we're going to put a pin in because when we start to talk about how we know God has a mind and a will, I think this one really becomes important. And the next one in our speed tour of the 5 ways is, I'm going to give you kind of my best guess at what on earth the 5th way means, because I think it's a bit confusing and people have different views, but I will give you what I think is going on here. So we can't have a regress of forms that allow a being to arrive at an end, or nothing would arrive at an end. So there must be a first intelligible something that grants existence to all forms such that they can be headed towards their final cause. And this thing must be its own existence, otherwise he would have to have his intelligible form granted existence. So basically we observe that there are intelligible things like forms or souls or something. There are patterns of intelligibility, be it the pattern that matter takes when it becomes an electron and not a proton. And this allows them to reliably reach an end. So what is causing the electron to reach that end? Well, it's electronness. Okay, great. But we have to have this intelligible structure getting existence, right? Because if an intelligible structure has no existence, it is nothing. But it's not nothing because we know they're here and they arrive at ends. So this pushes us towards, well, something must have brought about this intelligible form. Well, wait a minute. That thing needed to be granted existence by something, lest it be non-being. And we're moving on backwards, and we have to terminate in something whose essence is his existence, and that can give intelligibility to all subsequent things. So, can this be a material thing? No, certainly not, because it's, once again, composite. The main problem with all of these, it doesn't seem to be granting forms to things. And we don't think that material things or quarks or fields or whatever you want to fill this in are directing things towards an end from the beginning by giving intelligible forms. Literally, nobody's saying that, right? But that is part of our definition of what God is, this thing which is creating these types of intelligibilities, imbuing them with this, and then giving them existence and sending them off to an end. So that's what we mean by God, and material things do not meet that definition. So there are a whole bunch of definitions, 5 of them. I could have given you many more arguments for God and shown how material things do not fit the bill. I think we have a bunch of them. Let's pivot and talk about how do we know that this being, which we've concluded at 5 times now, whose essence is his existence, somehow has mind and will, right? We've ruled out any type of composite thing, any type of being which isn't pure good, any type of being which isn't pure truth, any type of being which is lower than the absolute height and cause of actuality. We've ruled out anything with potential. We've ruled out anything also with an admixture of not-being. We've ruled out a lot of things, and we're left with this one thing which everything's converging on. Does it have a mind and a will? Let's return to the first way. So actuality does not come from non-being or potential. It comes from pre-existing actuality. So we have mind and will and consciousness, and yet we have a pathetically small amount of actuality. Thus, God, who is infinite act, has far beyond this. So no actuality can exist if it's not preeminently in its cause. So any type of actuality of mind and will that we have must exist preeminently in the cause, which ultimately is pure actuality, God himself. So we know that from the first way, God has at least mind, at least will, at least consciousness. It's exceeding whatever we find in the created order, because whatever in the created order has is from God, the cause of all actuality. And again, I'm not getting into these arguments because that'd be an astoundingly long podcast. I have hit some of these in the past. If you want a deep dive in them, I can either give you sources or we can do each one. I'm just going to have to assume that you're broadly familiar with these. Yeah. All right. Off to the second way. So our minds are simple in the sense that they don't have material parts, so they do have metaphysical parts like essence and existence. Yet they're simple things that can bring things into composition, right? That's exactly what we do when we make an argument, when we form a thought, when we form an intention. We're bringing things into composition with something which is not itself composed, at least not composed of material parts. And there's arguments for why this is the case. You can go back to a lot of companion episodes you could look at from here. The one on AI and whether AI could ever be conscious. I explain a lot of philosophy of mind there and give some ideas about why the soul, we think it's actually immaterial. So you can go check that out. I also have another one which was covering annihilationism, where I get into some philosophy of mind things, talk about why we think the soul persists. That's another one to check out. And I'm opening up a lot of cans of worms here. Sorry about that. But we got to keep on chugging, guys. The second way is showing us that we have a non-composite composer of things. We already know, and there are people who have traced this out a little bit more deductively than I'm doing. I think since we already know of something that exists, which is simple, and yet can bring things into composition, it's not much of a leap to think, well, maybe that which is composing all things and yet is uncomposed would also be a mind. So that's the second way. Now the third way, so a necessary being, as say Avicenna argues, must be perfect, meaning having no potentiality that could or ought to be actualized, because that would be incompatible with the definition of necessity and thus impossible, because such a being would be dependent on a part, which it would apparently have here, which it can't because that's the definition. Further, if it had potential, it could change, but necessary beings cannot change. Thus, the being is filled out perfectly in all respects in unlimited and pure actuality. And we get that from the fact that it is utterly necessary. So one perfection or actuality is mind and will. And thus the necessary being has these perfections because it is all perfect by virtue of its necessity. And further, creation is not necessary. Thus, we see that there's an operation of this necessary being's will. We have a case here. It must have chosen, so we know it has will. And we know that the universes did not have to exist. Ergo, too much of a leap to say that this being with a mind and a will chose to create? I think that's quite reasonable. Avicenna might have a bit of a bone to pick with us there because he wants to stress the necessity which comes from the necessary being. That's beside the point. I think that I agree with some other guys who talk about the importance of this displaying God's will in light of the contingency of creation. All right, the fourth way. So I think the nobility thing really answers it, right? So if we have layers of actuality, we're way here, way down here. I mean, high compared to a rock, unbelievably infinitely small compared to our creator God. So God is the most actual, the most powerful, and the most perfect of all beings. Therefore, he would have, once again, the perfections and the actuality of mind and will. And since he's causing these, they exist preeminently in the cause, they exist in God. Now, they might not exist in the same way, they certainly don't, right? But it doesn't mean that they're not operative there. They're not powers of this one being. Okay, here's another one. So we have truth. So the classic definition of truth is it's the equation of intellect and being. So the cause of truth is therefore seems like an intellective being if truth is caused by this being, and truth is the equation of intellect and being. It seems like it would be a being that knows himself and knows the created order. That could cause all truth, if truth is the equation of intellect and being. So, would it be a big jump to say he has a will, if we know that he is the cause of all truth and thus has an intellect? Well, me and Aquinas don't think so. Aquinas doesn't think so. Who cares about this weirdo on the internet? He thinks that will is actually derivative of the power of mind, and you can find that in the early parts of the Summa, and read about that there. I think he makes an excellent argument. I believe it's also in the Summa Contra Gentiles, if you want to look that up too. So, he has the ability to will, he has the ability to think, he has an intellective nature, he has the ability to create, and Aquinas and many others pull out of this that God also then has the ability to love, right? Because he's willing the good of the other by willing things into being. So we have a loving, willing, intellective, all-powerful God. These are just a few of the divine attributes, but I think these are some big ones so far. Let's talk about the good. He's the cause of all goodness and the maximum of goodness. What is good? Good is that which it's like the bit of existence that one needs to perfect one's mode of being. So if you are a human being, you are a rational animal. So what is good for you, what is the good, is existence, but tailored towards actualizing your potential to, say, think, or have a will, or be a rational animal, right? But these chunks of existence which give you the perfections of mind come from the cause of all goodness, who is God. Ergo, power of mind and will and other such perfections, other such good things, pre-exist in God. And then we have the fifth way, right? The much unloved fifth way. It really comes in clutch here because we arrived at a being, an uncomposed being, who is somehow creating all of the intelligible forms for every single creature in the entire universe and then directing them to an end. Is it too much of a leap to say this is a mind and a will at work? To understand and create intelligible forms, that is the action of a mind. To understand them as such and then to direct them towards an end, that is willing something for them. So, once again, we have the same being that we concluded to with all five ways, and we very straightforwardly are finding intellect and will as a result of the definition of this being, right? All right, so that was a very brief and, let's face it, haphazard tour through a couple reasons here by, as I said earlier, some weirdo on the internet. But there are things called books, dear listeners, and people called real philosophers. Imagine if you heard from one of those guys. So I already referenced Phaser. He would be a great person to read if you want a little bit more information on this. You could read, the New Proofs for the Existence of God. He has some work on Aquinas. So if you're kind of a little bit unsure here, because I went through this pretty quick and didn't really explain each one of the 5 ways, I would really suggest that you dig into that patiently and methodically. I think oftentimes people hear, hey, God exists. They're like, really? Why? I have all these questions. It's like, okay, you do understand you're asking one of the biggest and most consequential question that a human being could possibly ask. The idea that you could just get like a short answer or like a brief response, and that would just fill out everything you need to know on the topic is not a reasonable expectation. Instead, you need to say, this is going to be the biggest intellectual payoff I could possibly imagine. The knowledge of God, understanding how we arrive at this, how he gets all the divine properties, how he syncs with the whole creation thing. This would be like the best thing to know ever. Probably worth a little bit of work. So I'm only giving you a very, very surface level tour of a few of the arguments by a few people. Grab some books on this, dig into this, because it certainly has a payoff. So this is something with a big intellectual payoff that I think is worth actually putting in the time to understand and understand fully, especially if you're bothered by this. If you're one of the people who feel like this is just a burning existential question, how do we know that God is X, Y, and Z? Follow that. That's wonderful. So I would certainly encourage you to keep going far past this podcast. And I'm going to give you another argument for why God has a mind and a will, why he has the divine attributes. And this one's kind of a bit of a funny one. It's an appeal to atheistic and naturalistic philosophers, because you're not going to find many, if any, atheist philosophers who go, you know what? I like this Aquinas. He's a smart guy. Yeah, I mean, he's concluding at this being time and time again, and yeah, I'm with it. I'm fine with it. It just seems like a material thing, or just seems like an entirely innocuous concept that we don't really need to assign any properties to, other than just raw causal oomph at the beginning of things. I'll just accept that. That's fine. I'll remain an atheist and be cool with that. Nope, I'll just scratch your argument. That doesn't happen, guys. It certainly doesn't happen. Professional atheist philosophers deny the 5 ways and other arguments for God for a darn good reason, because they're fully aware that you can unpack the divine attributes. They know this full well. They also don't just see the argument and say it's material, because they know darn well that it's not concluding it's something material. So the question is not, do the 5 ways and other arguments conclude to something immaterial and simple? Would we be able to extract the divine attributes? We pretty much have unanimous agreement that this is possible. Maybe people will quibble with this or that. But in general, I feel like atheists and theist philosophers would say, yes, if we grant these arguments for God, then we should also grant what follows on, the type of being which it's pointing towards, and one as an intellective and willing being. So really, to deny that, you're really facing everybody. You're paddling upriver pretty hard at that point. Now, maybe you reject some of these arguments for God. Not the subject of this episode. I don't think you should. But yeah, I mean, or maybe you just reject the entire metaphysics, right? But, it's not just a probabilistic question you're dealing with when you're asking these questions. It's a comparative question. So you're going to have to come up with like a rival theory and show why yours is more likely than the one that, say, I'm proposing. And, I mean, to just take an example, let's say we grant some of these arguments, and you listened to all of what I just said, pulling from each of the 5 ways, and thought, you kind of swayed me. I'll give you a 25% chance that one of these any of these arguments actually concludes at what you're saying it concludes. A God with, say, an intellect and a will. Okay, cool, you're at 25%. But given that if we have this being that we found out about, he either has an intellect and will or he doesn't, these are the two options, then let's say you're 25% on my side here. What's your rival case? What are your reasons? What are your arguments for why this being, a being whose essence is his existence, does not, could not, or would not have these properties? There aren't that many arguments for that. One could be issues of modal collapse, which I personally think is a bit of a paper tiger. And if you have some good modal collapse objections, send them over. Happy to deal with those. You could say, well, there's a problem with God knowing contingent facts, so maybe the idea that there's an intellect in God is impossible because that would actually imply some type of potentiality to know. But I think you just have it bass-backwards about how knowledge works in God. It's not a causal arrow going from creation to God, but vice versa. So I think that one's just a bad objection, and for other reasons too. But seriously, you're going to have to make your case, and then you have to show, well, what's the likelihood that your case has actually proven that this being, if we acknowledge this being, doesn't have intellect and will? And then we need to compare the two probabilities, because it can only go one of two ways. Either he has intellect and will, or he doesn't. So let's say the other side has a 5% chance of locking down proof that God doesn't have an intellect and will. Well, then this is a 5-to-1 shot that I'm right, even if you were not terribly impressed with the argument that I presented, which I think it's a good argument. So it's the comparative certainty of these contrary claims, not just your subjective emotional state of feeling convinced. It has to do with the strength of these arguments. We don't need to care so much about what's happening with our bespoke psychology. Like, I'm not convinced. It's like, okay, but you have to compare the strength of these arguments versus the strength of their opposites. It's a comparative probability issue because only one or the other is right. You can't just judge by how I feel. Cool. All right. Well, let's round out this episode with some stuff about hell. We go on a wild diatribe here, and I hope you enjoy it. The question is basically, is God being a narcissist for demanding that we love him? Is he being somehow unjust? This person also seems to think that we would have to agree with God's judgment in order to be judged. I couldn't entirely tell what it was, but we're going to deal with a broad swath of common hell things. Here's how we're going to begin. People get all mixed up over the topic of hell because they think they know more about hell than they actually know. So I'm going to talk about what you don't know about hell, all right? First, you and I don't know what hell is, and we just need to stop pretending like we do, all right? You don't know what hell is. I'd say you also don't know how evil you or others actually are, in part because there's many people who have not even had the opportunity to be evil. Maybe they're too cowardly to be evil. Maybe they're super evil, but they're just constrained by law, constrained by people who are more powerful than themselves, and yet they're desperately wicked. We don't know. You don't know. I don't know. You also don't know how evil you are because you don't know how much your guardian angel is helping you out. This is an angelic being whose one job is to get you into heaven, and presumably is pretty darn good at that. So what happens if your guardian angel stops running defense for you, and then your soul gets to go to evil as much as it would without your guardian angel's help? I don't know. You don't know. What about God's grace? God is pumping grace into his universe like gangbusters, and he's upholding you from sin to a large degree, strengthening you, especially if you're participating in his church. We have the prayers of the saints, praying for people to choose good and avoid evil. What happens if that stops? What happens in hell when we no longer have all of this grace upholding us? Do we get more evil? Yeah, we do. How much more evil? I don't know. What would we then merit? because we continue to merit punishment while we're in hell? I don't know, and you don't know, okay? Here's another one. God called his creation very good. So when he made the world and he put us in it, it was a very good world. So could it be that we would be much more evil if we were broken out of our bodies and then we were just souls? I think so, because at the moment of the angels' creation, they either darted towards God or they went away from God. And it happened at the moment of their creation. So maybe when we're freed from this body, which allows us to make step-by-step slow progress either towards virtue or vice, when we're broken off and we're just souls, we're divided from our bodies before the general resurrection, maybe we just do what the angels do. We either surge towards God in a moment, or we go away from him and we just exhaust ourselves in a heap in hell. How evil will we be once we make that journey? One that could have taken 1,000 lifetimes here in this good creation in our bodies step by step, but is done all at once at the point of being broken off from our bodies at death. How evil will you be and what will you merit? You don't know. I don't know. Nobody knows. So we don't know what hell is. We don't know how evil we are or would become. We don't know what grace is upholding us. Other things. You have no idea what damage your sin has done. There are people who have lived, say, 1,000 years ago, whose evil acts have caused pain and suffering for 1,000 years hence. What is the fair punishment for that? I don't know, but I do know that our sin has consequences which ripple out from the source. You don't know what punishments are in hell. Council of Florence teaches that hell is not equal for all people. So if you're super evil, you get a very bad punishment. Not really evil, punishment's not near as bad. And for some who have not done any actual sin, and the church historically said, well, what about people who may have been baptized but then immediately die? Or there's certain like tricky scenarios. There's even a place for people who only get the pain of loss, meaning you simply are missing out, right? So it's not like there's actual punishments as much because there's no actual sin that you did. You just didn't win the lottery. It's like if at Mass in the homily, your priest was giving away winning lottery numbers and you didn't go to Mass that time. Well, you're going to experience pain, but nothing is taken from you, right? You just didn't get this incredible wealth of winning the lottery. That could be hell for some people, where they receive the pain of loss. They didn't get the lottery winning reward of going to heaven, but maybe they died at a point, baptized, boom, or I guess unbaptized, and then never committed a sin, so maybe a child or something. Sorry, you know what I mean? Those weird scenarios, right? Yeah, so that could be, right? Council of Florence teaches that there are different places in hell, that there are different punishments in hell, and that you can't believe that the punishments are the same, because that would obviously be wrong. So we don't know what they are. We just know that they're just. We also don't know how time works in hell. So I have an ongoing work trying to figure out some philosophy of time stuff, and out of that theory drops that hell would have a very slow timeline, at least in my view, which means it could take millions of years in our time to even progress a couple moments in hell. Those moments are ridiculously extended. So it could be that your finite crimes on Earth simply take a nigh on to eternity to actually atone for in hell, because there's a time difference where heaven, time moves most quickly, Earth is kind of in between, and then hell, each moment lasts for an unbelievable amount of time. So for those people, they might actually experience that moment at the same rate that we would, however, objectively is passing much more slowly. So that could kind of answer some of the proportionality problems about how they could be punished for such a long time if their sins were finite. Well, it could be that we have a huge dilation in the speed of time. And I think that's a very ad hoc thing to just put in there, unless you already have a theory of time which you defend independently. And then this is something which drops out of that, which for me it does. For others, your mileage may vary. Another thing, So God is the good. He's the cause of all good. He's the maximum of good. So somebody's rejection of him is a type of self-harm. So hell is a place that you are exiling yourself. That's quite true. And you're doing it because you've habituated your soul to self-harm, to choosing self in a misguided way in opposition to choosing God in a way which is kind of cause you to flourish. Because again, God is the cause of all goodness. He's the one who sends those little chunks of existence such that you could fill out in the way that you're meant to be, so that you can be perfected, which means fully made. He is creator from start to finish. He wants to continue to create you. But if you say no to that, then you're stuck in an imperfected state, one that he doesn't want you to be, right? He's the cause of goodness. But you can reject that goodness because, like him, we have wills, and we can choose to love God even to the contempt of self, or self even to the contempt of God. And if we do the latter, then we're separating ourselves from the cause of our own perfection, and that is simply self-harm. To wrap it up, you don't know what perfect justice is, and neither do I. We have no framework for what our sin actually deserves, how evil we or others are without God's help. We do know that hell is not the maximum punishment. In fact, Thomas Aquinas says that God actually holds back from what he could do. He exercises mercy even to the damned. So some experience in hell very different punishments, very different and just punishments, even as little as simply the pain of loss and those special circumstances of dying in a way where you're not baptized or not in communion with God, but you have not sinned. Messed that up earlier, guys. What you gonna do? The show is free. Let's see. So we also don't know how time works. We don't know what punishments are. We don't know what it's going to be like for us and what we're going to be like after the general resurrection, when we've had that period of being separated from our body and then we're joined back to it. So basically, my bottom line with hell is people who object to hell are only doing so erroneously, assuming a host of things that they can't possibly know. And they're ignoring what is literally the most certain thing that has ever been revealed ever. And here it is. When you think that God is wrong to have hell, you are ignoring the fact that God has driven home in every freaking page of Scripture that God loves you. God loves your loved ones. God loves all of creation more than you do, more than you ever possibly could. He tells us from the very start of Revelation that he's a father and that we are his children. So if it wasn't clear enough that he loves us and wants what's best for us, our judge at the end of time became a man and proved that he would sooner be ripped apart, beaten, mocked, tortured, and then killed than let that happen to us. So Christ, our judge, humbly walked among us, loved us, was killed for us, and he's going to be the judge at the end of time. So don't listen to all this garbage that God is narcissistic. He humbled himself to become a man, and then he was punished to show us how much we are loved. Don't listen to this garbage that God is unjust. He is merciful from start to finish, and he loves his creation way more than you could ever imagine. Don't listen to this garbage that God is just waiting to put people in hell, and he just can't wait to torment them. No, he's revealed himself as a father, not a nutcase. The reason anybody goes to heaven is, it's got to always involve humility, right? Pride is really the genesis of all these sins. And I think it is just unbelievably arrogant to assume evil things about our good God and then judge him for what you think you know about hell. That is unbelievably arrogant. Instead, I think the right posture is to know that God is good, he will administer perfect justice, and that we need to trust him to do that, and not somehow think that we know better than God. So stop assuming things about hell that you have no idea about, and only focus on the fact that God has revealed himself as Father. He loves you and all creation. He would sooner go to the cross than have you go to hell. That's my bottom line on hell. Sum it up with, we don't know what it is, but God is good. Great. All right. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed this. I hope for the fellow who emailed me, I hope I answered your question, gave it a go. I think we've laid out a good case today why God cannot just be the universe or part of the universe, physical thing, or some type of principle like that. We looked at all 5 ways. We learned why God does, in fact, have intellect and will that's actually implied from each one of those things. And yeah, you got a bonus segment about the wild diatribe about hell. So thanks for listening, guys. I'll give you the email address of the show just one more time. If you have any questions, comments, you can also comment on the podcasty YouTubes and things. That's always appreciated too. And let's see, what else? Oh, show suggestions. I appreciate those. Mailbag questions. Appreciate those. And I know what I was thinking. Share the podcast, guys. If you enjoy the podcast, enjoy the YouTube thing, just find 1 or 2 people who you think might benefit from a given episode and do me a favor and send them that episode. Maybe it's, I don't know, the one about, divine hiddenness. A lot of people are worried about, where is God? How come I can't meet him in prayer? How come he doesn't reveal himself in a more obvious way? If you know somebody who might be dealing with that, send them that episode or anything that you think they might appreciate. Because if you listen and you appreciate, maybe other people will too. And strangely, the listens at the beginning of summer have gone exploded downwards in dramatic fashion. So I need you guys to revive them. Last time I asked you guys to share with a friend, it exploded in the upward direction. I certainly appreciated that. I'll stop blathering on. Thanks for listening, guys, and I hope you join me next week.